Please, honey, she asked. It really shouldn't be in there, as she said in a confiding tone. Yeah. Ashley chimed in belatedly. It's only fair. Brad Sugar, come here, Ashley ordered. You got something to get out too, as she told him. Girls, Brad began. He didn't really know what to do to end this quickly and quietly enough to not create a disturbance. He looked at Connor, hoping the man would have some idea. Don't look at me, Connor said. He was looking speculatively at Ashley and back at his wife. If the truth be known, Connor commented, the woman outranks me. I'm a first lieutenant, she's a captain. I can't order her to do a damn thing. Damn straight, Janie muttered. Stand at attention, soldier, as she commanded with a small hiccup. She peered at her husband and giggled. She pointed at Connor. Well, something is standing at attention anyway. Connor began a half-turn but checked himself. Please, Connor, honey, Janie said in a little girl's voice. Will you please get this thing out? Brad tried to concentrate, but he couldn't. The two drunk women weren't going quietly. Brad glanced around the parking lot again. There were a number of cars there, but he couldn't see anyone in them, and there was nobody walking around in the lot either. Come here, drunk, he said, taking his wife's arm. Come on, Connor, he remarked. Bring the captain back here before she falls down. Brad chuckled. Leading everyone around to the other side of the car, he checked for onlookers again, but found none. They were right on the edge of the paved lot and no one would be coming up behind them. There was a small stand of trees and brush. The closest lamppost was too far away for much light. In fact, the moon over their shoulders would provide most of the illumination for what they were about to do. It wasn't private, by any means, but it was better than nothing. He smiled in Ashley's face, kissed her, then dropped to his knees. Glancing at the other couple, Brad saw Connor was only a beat behind. He was having fun now. He caught it and began to pull it out. He heard Janie say, do it like Brad is doing. Brad chuckled to himself. Janie was every bit the senior officer of the two. Abruptly, he saw an image of Janie laying with Connor. Irreverently, he wondered if Janie gave all the orders in that situation also. Brad grinned up at his wife. I love the taste, don't you, Connor? Brad asked roguishly. I never get enough of it, he added. Oh my God, Janie said. Brad shot a glance toward the other couple to see Connor silently following Brad's lead. Finished, Brad handed it to his wife. Surprised, Ashley took it. When he stood, she let him urge her backward. He moved closer still. Get up there, he told Ashley in a low whisper. On the hood, lady, he explained. Ashley, having a good idea what her husband intended. Satisfied with what he'd done, Brad straightened and stepped back. No, Ashley whimpered. Please, honey, more. Brad replied. You come down here, he told her. God. Janie said thickly off to the side. Brad glanced her way to see she and Connor both were watching. When they done, the women kissed while the men looked on and exchanged toys promising to get together for that lunch anyway. On the way home, Ashley refused to confine herself with the seatbelt and cuddled next to her husband on the bench seat. So, what do you think about this, honey? She asked softly. What? Brad answered. We didn't. Yes, we did, Ashley insisted. That's what it is, couples having it, watching other people and being watched. She stroked her husband's arm for a moment while he digested what she'd said. Well, he said after a long while, it wasn't so bad. Ashley's breath came faster. She felt her pulse increase again. He knew the promise was a dead thing now and no longer relevant. Perhaps it always had been, right from the beginning. So, Ashley demanded the next morning. Tell me. She took a quick swig of coffee and grinned suggestively. Brad knew what she was talking about. She hadn't spoken of anything else since they got up. So, okay, maybe I don't feel so dead set against the thing you call it, the lifestyle anymore, Brad said slowly, hesitating to go further. But that's a big maybe, he said quickly. Ashley's expression didn't change one iota. She was too intent on getting something more from her husband this morning and nothing he said or did was going to deflect her. Brad wasn't even certain she heard what he'd said. It was exciting to watch Connor do it, wasn't it? Ashley said softly. Wasn't it? Come on, admit it, honey, as she coaxed. There's nothing wrong with being honest with yourself and me nothing at all, as she went on. Though the kids were still with her mom this morning, she was whispering to low for anyone else to hear. It was so good, wasn't it? I guess so, Brad replied reluctantly. I thought it would be different, but... Yes, I know, Ashley said in a low, husky voice. She wet her lips. Her eyes were lit with a hidden fire. I wanted you to take Connor's place with her, as she said. It was more a whimper than anything else. She stood and stepped behind her husband. Leaning over, she swept her palms from his neck out to the points of his shoulders and down his arms. She kissed the nape of his neck and nipped at his earlobes. I wanted you to take Janie right there, Ashley whispered in his ear. It would have been so exciting to watch it. Her voice was excited. She would have let you, baby, Ashley moaned softly. She wanted you to it. So you could do it with Connor? Brad asked her. He tried to keep the hurt and anger out of his voice. It was probably unnecessary. Ashley wasn't listening for such subtleties. Oh, he was a lot smaller than you are, darling, Ashley said matter-of-factly. He would have been out of action for a long time. Brad didn't reply. She'd clearly anticipated the question and she hadn't really answered the question he'd asked, but he wasn't inclined to call her on it this time. He'd fought this for so long and there was nothing left inside him to fight any longer. A man had to know when to cut his losses. She'd never know just how he really felt about this, though. There was no point. He tried and failed. Ashley sobbed her frustration when she couldn't get to him. Good to see everybody, the balding little man said. Brad had the impression the club owner was barely restraining himself from rubbing his hands together in glee. He had that look about him. So, you're all thinking of joining our little community here behind the green door. He laughed at his own joke. The club's name was the Green Door, a not-so-subtle hint of mysterious goings-on that took place within. Brad shifted restlessly in his seat. The churning in his stomach would not go away, no matter how hard he tried to pacify it. This wasn't something he wanted to do, but he saw no alternative. Ashley shot a brief glance at her husband. My wife keeps after me to stop trying to make jokes, the little man said in a resigned tone. So, okay, let's get going. We like to bring prospective new members in for a talk like this before your first visit to clear the air, so to speak. We don't want folks to be surprised by anything the first time they visit the Green Door, and we don't want there to be any misconceptions about what the lifestyle is actually about. He looked all around to make eye contact with each of the 6 new prospective members. The first thing you need to know, he said, is that a no means no, period, end of discussion. No one will force any of you ladies to do anything you don't want to do. When you tell a man or a couple you don't want to play, they will leave you alone, or they get to leave, and they won't be invited back anytime soon, he told them. What about men? Brad interjected quietly when the man would have gone on. I beg your pardon? What about men? Brad repeated patiently. If I don't want to play with a woman, I can't tell her no like a woman could tell a man? The club owner looked at Brad strangely for a moment. Well, of course, he said finally. Just checking, Brad assured him. From the way you said it, it seemed like only the ladies had that option. Glad to know I was mistaken. After a second close inspection, the proprietor decided to laugh it off. He chuckled as he was responding to a good joke. No, not at all, Mr. Rogers, he said, peering at a typed list through thick glasses. He chuckled again. Course, like I always say, this lifestyle is a woman's theme park, he joked. Us guys are just along for the ride. Indeed, Brad said delicately. And why would you say that? For the first time, Ashley reached out to take his hand and hold it tightly. She knew that tone. Brad was not happy and might explode if provoked badly enough. Well, the other man said, women have the ability to accept for more offers in a short time frame, if you know what I mean. Men can only do it so many times and the pumps run dry, right? Brad's eyes narrowed to slits. Is that right? He asked flatly. Well, sure, the little man replied. And there are a lot of unattached males in the club too, you know. He added. The women in our club have them to turn to any time, and they frequently need to. We men just can't keep up with them. Now can we, young fella? Unattached males? Brad asked slowly. You let single males in here? The man nodded slowly, almost unbelievingly. Surely Mr. Rogers knew a little about how things worked in a club. Well, to be fair, the owner said quickly, there are also a number of unattached single females in our membership also. But not nearly as many as there are single males, and these women are, more often than not, looking for an encounter with another woman and not necessarily a man, right? Brad shot back. The other man nodded reluctantly. I've heard couples should set up rules that apply only to them, that they should talk and resolve issues that might be hurtful to one or the other before they get too far down this road. Is that right, sir? Brad asked, apparently changing the topic. When the other man nodded, Brad continued, so if I was a smart married man, I'd work out a rule with my wife that everything we did, We do as a couple and only with other couples, wouldn't I? He remarked. Certainly, the club owner replied. He spoke quickly, eager to leave this subject behind. Now, we have a few more things to go over. We wanted to talk about theme nights, alcohol, and regretfully, we'll have to go over our policy too. We have a very strict policy on drugs. We will not tolerate any on the premises at all. He looked around at his captive audience. Okay, parking privileges while here at the club. Walking to the car after the orientation meeting, Ashley let her husband see she was irritated. Her stalking pace was a message she intended him to read. You could have waited till we got out to be a jerk, Ashley remarked tightly. You. Brad spun around and dragged her to a stop by grabbing both her wrists and stopping her momentum cold in the space between two heartbeats. You're still my wife, he told her coldly. I'm letting you get away with a lot of things. I'm even following you into this thing even though I'm pretty sure it's a mistake. But woman, you better hear this. Here are a couple of rules we will be living by come hell or high water. First, any we get into here or at those house parties and they're talked about will be it we do as a couple. Understand? Second, if I find you've been messing around with single guys in the club or meeting them outside in spite of telling me you won't, you'll be looking for your fourth husband because I'll divorce you quicker and you can whistle Dixie. You hear me, wife? He'd carefully stuffed both hands in his pockets when he began talking. A faint trembling marked Brad's intensity. It was what his body did when he was using every bit of his self-control not to be physical. Third, he added, as the idea occurred to him, oh, if you lie to me about one goddamn thing from this point on, your ass is grass then too. You better get that through your skull and live by it. Ashley, I won't say it again. I know that was 3 things, he said after a moment of deep breaths. He snorted. So sue me, he said flatly. He turned and marched off to find their car. On the way home, Ashley agreed to the first 2 non-negotiable rules he'd put to her and paid lip service to the third. She supposed he just threw that in for shits and grins as he said sometimes. The other 2 were things she had to address and they were serious. She said she'd have agreed anyway he didn't have to be so mean. Privately, she wasn't so sure about the idea they had to do everything as a couple. It meant she wouldn't be free to roam a club to find new, unknown men to have that first breathless, incredibly exciting experience with. That thrill would be limited to men she and her husband met, essentially, standing side by side. She'd had much greater independence when she and Scott, her second husband, had been in the lifestyle. She'd roamed and so had he. Okay. Brad sighed as he turned off the ignition. He'd selected a parking place far from entrance to the green door. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't want to do it, but he was going to do it. He'd promised. We're okay with the rules, he asked Ashley while staring straight ahead. And we're not going to do anything tonight. No making out, no playing with body parts, and no action. This is just to scout things out and get comfortable, right? Absolutely, Ashley said quickly, doing her best to reassure her husband. She'd sensed a withdrawal in Brad as the week had wound down. Brad was clearly dreading tonight's first visit to the club, and she needed to be as understanding and supportive as possible. You've got to say a word, right? She asked. Either one of us begins to feel uncomfortable or pressured, all we have to do is say it, and we both get up and leave, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, honey. She smiled reassuringly at Brad when he glanced worriedly at her. An hour later, Brad was beginning to relax. Ashley hadn't left his side the whole time while they'd walked hand in hand around on a tour of the place. Even when she had to go, she'd made him escort her to the restroom's outer door and wait for her. When he had to, she waited nearby for him to come out. When he popped out, she was alone and smiling sweetly at him. They found a table near a small dance floor and ordered drinks. Brad had a Diet Coke with a squeeze of lemon because he was driving. Ashley asked for a white one. The house wine was good enough. Brad watched the dancers carefully. The women were dressed more sexily than he'd seen in the city's nightclubs, no doubt about it. They danced with each other, touching, kissing, and openly fondling the men they were with, and other women too. Hi, I don't think we've met y'all, said a woman's voice to Brad's left rear. He turned to find a tall man with thinning hair and an attractive, 30-something woman smiling at him. Where the slender man's hair was receding and turning gray, the woman's was coal black and cut short around the head. She was in a blue mini dress. She was short, but the 5-inch heels she wore saved her. I'm sorry, Brad said, apologizing and rising automatically. Good manners were something ingrained in his soul. I'm Brad, this is Ashley, he said, introducing himself and his wife. How are you? Ashley asked the couple, pleased someone had come over to introduce themselves. She knew the members in some clubs were more than a little clannish and tended to exclude newcomers at first. We're fine, The man replied. I'm Jerry and my beautiful wife Sheila, he added. They shook hands all around, and then there was a tiny break. Oh, Brad exclaimed. What am I thinking? Please, we'd like for you to join us if you have a moment. It had been one of his and Ashley's goals for tonight talk with some of the club members to get a feel for the place. Jerry and Sheila accepted and each took a seat at the small table. Instead of sitting together, though, they separated. Automatically knowing the protocol in these places from the old days, Ashley slipped out of her seat and Sheila sat down. Jerry held out a chair for Ashley near one he would claim as his. She smiled brightly up at him. So do you guys come here often? As Sheila asked Brad. She included Ashley in the question only at the last moment by glancing her way. Nope, first time, Brad admitted in a voice too hearty and louder than he'd wanted it to be. Me and Ashley are just getting into this, he told the couple, deciding to plow on rather than stop to admit embarrassment and confusion. And I think we need to be upfront with you. We're not going to be playing tonight. We're here to get ourselves acclimated, so to speak. Well, don't you worry about that, Sheila commented and stroked Brad's arm protectively. Jerry and me will take good care of you, she said protectively. Have you and Jerry been in the lifestyle long? Ashley asked hurriedly. Brad did not like being patronized, and Ashley had caught the momentary tightening of his jaw. For 6 years now, Jerry answered for his wife. We love it. I don't think I've ever seen Sheila so happy as she's been these past few years, he added. And you? Brad asked curiously. Jerry replied. Have you been happy these past 6 years? Brad explained. Jerry looked at him blankly for a moment. Well, sure. I mean, it takes a little getting used to, he added hastily. Sometimes we have to talk things over to get by some tough spots, but we've learned, haven't we, sweetheart? He appealed to his wife. Brad had the impression Sheila talked at Jerry to get them through some tough spots, but perhaps that was unfair. He had no evidence one way or the other. Yeah, Brad remarked casually, but we're going to make sure we never stop communicating, aren't we, love? He asked Ashley directly. Yep, Ashley said, smiling. She turned to Sheila. You have to? Don't you think? Sheila nodded after a brief hesitation. They talked for over an hour. Jerry was restless and got up twice to get himself a drink from the bar. None of the others had more than one, and Brad was still limiting himself to a soda every now and then. Sheila took command of the conversation, guiding it always into something of a sexual nature. The more she talked, the more her chair seemed to levitate into Brad's space. Brad never saw her actually scoot it closer, it just happened. Sugar, as Sheila murmured softly into Brad's ear. She was leaning far to her left and making as much body contact with Brad as she could. You're so tense, big fella, you need to relax and go with the flow, okay? Brad had to tear his eyes off the dance floor. Girl was dancing alone, but she wouldn't be by herself for long. There was a stir in the room. People were moving around purposefully. What? Brad asked in confusion. I'm sorry, I missed that, he apologized. Sheila glanced at the dance floor and pursed her lips in a momentary disapproval. They really should be in the back rooms, she said dismissively. It's not against the rules for the front room, but really. She turned back to Brad. What I said, stud, she said, returning to her topic. Oh, is you need to loosen up and let things happen naturally. Know what I mean, as she added. She leaned in closer. Everyone says I give the most fantastic you know what in the world, as she breathed into his ear. That's just what you need, darling man, as she said. Brad barely caught her wrist before she would have yanked it down. No thanks, Sheila, Brad said, hoping his tone was polite enough. Ashley and I agreed we wouldn't be going that far this evening, he added. According to the rules, that would end this embarrassing episode. He hoped Sheila and Jerry understood. They should, he thought. Sheila slipped off her chair and moved around behind Brad's. Once there, she leaned over. Showing him herself was only the first step, though. Brad leaned back to avoid her. Giving him a little pout, she changed tactics and dropped to her knees in front of her intended target. No, Sheila, I told you. Brad began. Go ahead, honey, Brad heard Ashley say. I won't mind, really. Brad's eyes snapped to the side where he saw Jerry's right hand had established itself on Ashley's left thigh. No, Brad said firmly. Ashley, we're going to have to go check on the babysitter, he said forcefully. Holding Sheila's shoulders in his hands, he pushed his chair back and stood. Ashley froze at Brad's reference to the babysitter. Using that word in any context meant the evening was over. She flushed bright red. She was just beginning to feel good, and now Brad was calling a halt to everything. Ashley got to her feet reluctantly and mumbled some excuses no one heard and wouldn't have believed if they had. Sheila was only beginning to scramble to her feet when Ashley turned and walked quickly after her husband. She had a feeling he wasn't going to wait for her very long if she delayed any at all. "Bradley, what is wrong?" as she asked when they got home. He'd refused to say a word in the car on the way. "I don't understand. You got offered by Sheila and that's all. What did you think happens in that club?" Ashley was beginning to get mad. She wasn't the most patient of women, and it seemed every time they moved forward a little, something happened in her husband's tiny little brain to ruin it. Brad stared at her. "You don't remember agreeing with me there wouldn't be any this evening?" he asked harshly. "You don't remember there wasn't to be any making out, remember that?" "Well, you were the one getting all," Ashley retorted heatedly. "That woman was all over you, I saw it," as she said stiffly. "Then you saw me doing my damnedest to get her off me," Brad shot back. "Contrast that to you letting that guy do it," he continued. "What do you expect?" Ashley argued. "That wasn't a PDA meeting, you idiot, it was a club. People go there to have it." "I expect you to follow the rules we set up for this thing, for ourselves," Brad said icily. "I expect you to do what you say you're going to do and not do the things you say you won't. I expect to be able to trust you, Ashley, and right now all you've shown me is you can't be trusted even sitting at the same table. What's going to happen when, or rather if I agree to go all the way?" Ashley sat on the sofa with a defiant look on her face. As she sat and Brad paced, her expression softened. "All I was doing was trying to encourage you," as she said finally. "I thought if you had just a little bit more confidence, if you knew I wasn't going to be judgmental, then you could get over the hump and have some fun, honey," as she said in a cajoling tone. "We made an agreement with each other," Brad snapped back. "You don't go back on your word, Ashley, ever." "Baby," Ashley sighed. "Okay, I'm sorry I got a little excited and pushed you too far. I know I was wrong to do that, but it seemed like we were finally getting." She stopped when she saw Brad shaking his head. "I'm so tired of hearing that excited bullshit, Ashley." "No more excuses, Ash," he told her. "No more goddamned excuses or this whole thing is out the window, at least for me. You make your choice, Ash. I've had it. This is the last time I'm going to ask you to keep your side of the bargain, any bargain, or it's over, period." He stalked toward the kitchen. There was a six-pack of beer in the fridge and he needed one in the worst way right now. It had taken months to get past it. Ashley had had a hard time understanding Brad's point of view, and he hers. In the end, they'd cautiously tested the waters at the Green Door twice more with their rules and agreements firmly in place. The second time had only been 2 weeks ago. Ashley had pledged to honor the agreement not to have any physical contact. Brad had tested her, appearing to be tempted by a young, long-haired blonde there with her tall, apparently well-endowed husband. Ashley politely refused the man's advances in spite of the fact Brad made sure she had plenty to drink. In the end, Brad was forced to decline an invitation to join an A with the couple. They decided Ashley was a wallflower and not into the lifestyle. Tonight was going to be the first time their initial agreements were laid aside. The rules of only doing things as a couple, always going home alone and together were still intact. They decided on a third rule: no cuddling with any partner after it. This was it and only it. They decided it was not to ever be confused with love. Ashley wore a new miniskirt for the occasion of what she teasingly referred to as Brad's coming out party. It was short and hot pink. As for himself, Brad had chosen a dark blue pair of pants, a light gray tightly tailored pullover shirt, and the black dress boots he always wore for a night out. Ashley thought he looked very handsome. He was a hottie, she told him, absolutely delicious. His reaction to her outfit was unspoken, but unmistakable. "Hi, I'm Glenna," the tall blonde said and held out her hand to Brad. He was taken aback at first. He knew her, if this was the woman he was thinking of, and it was an unusual name. "Brad," he said smoothly, turning away from the bar where he and Ashley were trying to get served. He looked this Glenna over, sure she was one of Ashley's old partners in the game. She stood quietly as he ran his eyes over her. Tall, slender without being skinny. Her dark hair was piled high on her head, leaving her heart-shaped face and slim neck fully exposed. She was pretty, not a classic beauty, but her attractiveness would age much better than most of them in that category. "Glenna," Ashley said, "you look absolutely lovely tonight." Ashley was a little nervous, and it showed. "Thanks, Ash, and you looks good," Glenna returned with a laugh. "Brad, you're going to have to keep your eye on this woman," as she said. "Oh, I shall. Count on it," Brad murmured and shot a glance at Ashley. He was wondering if she was going to come clean about knowing this woman or not. "Brad, honey," Ashley said, "Glenna is an old friend of mine from before I met you," as she finished. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Hartford," Brad said. "And how is Dean tonight?" he inquired. Both women were startled. He's parking. He's fine. Thank you, Glenna replied, confused. He's parking the car. This dress isn't one I want to take a hike in through that parking lot, she added. Glenna and Ashley eyed each other for a moment before turning their gazes back to Brad. He let them stew for a moment, pretending to sample the Diet Coke the bartender had finally delivered. He really didn't like the ick taste, but it would have to do. They didn't have the beverage on tap here. He noticed the women's faces. Oh, you called the house? Oh, last summer sometime, Brad said finally. You left a message for Ashley to call you. I got home before Ash did that day and heard it, he told Glenna. Ash told me who you were, he added. I see, Glenna remarked. You sure do have a great memory, she said. Thank you, Brad replied. Ashley watched them, still confused. Brad hadn't displayed that good a memory in the 3 years they'd been married so far. But she remembered the call. It had scared the crap out of her at the time. She thought Brad had found out about all her secret internet surfing, but the moment had passed. Hey everyone, a man dressed in a sports jacket and slacks said by way of introduction. Glenna took his arm possessively and hugged him close. Ashley, Brad, this is Dean, as she told them. Brad held out his hand and got a strong handshake from the other man. Glad to meet you, Brad told the man. Let's go over to a table, Ashley suggested. They all agreed. On the way, Ashley glanced into her husband's eyes. Are you mad at me? As she asked in a whisper. About inviting Glenna and Dean here tonight? That's what you did, right? He replied. He considered the question for a couple of steps. No, I'm not mad. This is in the nature of a surprise and I don't mind those, he told her. He grasped her lightly just above the elbow and pulled her close for a quick kiss before they walked on. The jacuzzi was small enough they probably wouldn't be disturbed until the club grew more crowded. Glenna was almost in Brad's lap while Ashley sat hip to hip with Dean. Hope you don't mind the jacuzzi and all, Dean remarked. I know, it's a darn cliche for two couples to meet, have dinner then get together in the tub to cement things, but what can you do? He asked cheerfully. It's a cliche because it works, right? Only's thing missing is the darn barbecue, he said mournfully. Glenna wouldn't let me bring in the ribs, he said in a hoarse pretended whisper. She thought they would be a little much, he remarked. Don't know why. They all laughed. Brad was surprised at how easily he'd been able to chuckle at Dean's joke. He hadn't believed he'd be able to respond so naturally while he was under the stress he was feeling. Glenna took the opportunity to close the distance between her and Brad. Brad let her, remembering this was what they'd come here for tonight. In a way, not being able to would solve a myriad of problems. Glenna sighed. You glad to see Glenna? As she asked facetiously, she was pleased. Brad shrugged. So much for that way out. She loved talking dirty. Her facial expression showed she meant every word of it. Brad watched Ashley and Dean surreptitiously. He was anxious that Ashley would soon be doing something with Glenna's husband. At the same time, he was resigned to the fact she was going to have it with the guy. He knew the two feelings would drive him insane if left unresolved, but he didn't know what to do about them. Suddenly, Glenna was scooting her away from Brad's side. She slid a hand. Hey. Brad yelped and lifted away from the attack. Thanks, Glenna quipped and did what she could. Brad groaned and almost yanked his hips back down, away from the new assault. Just in time, he stopped. Sorry, old bean. Dean said with a horrible rendition of a British accent. Should have warned you. Ashley groaned. Brad joined in, but that was because Glenna was trying also. It wasn't that bad, Dean said in a wounded tone. Come on. Ashley said something, but Brad's entire attention was focused on Glenna. There, Glenna said with satisfaction. She grinned up at Brad and pulled his head down for a long kiss. Brad looked over to see Ashley just ending a kiss than he'd gotten from Glenna. Come on, lover, Glenna cooed in his ear. Come on, Bradley, sugar, Glenna purred. Brad had automatically risen when she did. He was standing on the floor of the jacuzzi. He was ready and then he hesitated. Unsure, he looked at Ashley as she sat watching with Dean down where Brad couldn't see her do it. Brad didn't know what to do. He loved Ashley more than anything. This was wrong. He knew it was. Suddenly Ashley was beside him. Brad, honey, as she said quietly, Glenna loves like yours. Brad didn't move. Take it, Ashley hissed. She watched for a long moment. Brad made hesitant moves. Hey. Glenna protested in a muffled voice. Let me say, we gotta get a move on here, as she announced. Brad looked down. He began chuckling and then couldn't stop. Dizzy blonde, he repeated. He roared. It was suddenly the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Okay, he said, when he could control his breathing again. He never knew when Ashley sat back down to watch Brad. If he'd looked, he would have seen a trace of confusion on her face. It was confusing. She leaned back against Dean. She wasn't going to do it tonight. There wasn't going to be anything to set Brad off and send him running out of the club tonight. She'd hold off and wait for another night. It wasn't fair to leave Dean hanging, though. Glenna. Brad gasped. "Why?" "Go ahead," as she panted. Abruptly, there was no more resisting. Dean only smiled. He knew his wife. "Damn," as she said finally, "that was pretty darn good for a rookie," as she joked. Brad chuckled, pleased with her compliment and grateful for her sense of humor. It had made things easier tonight. Thinking of Ashley, he glanced over to see her trading kisses with Dean. "Damn, Ashley," Glenna exclaimed. "You been keeping something from us, girlfriend?" Glenna remarked. "Come here, sugar," Glenna told Brad. When the evening was done, Brad had had it 4 times. She was exhausted, but happy. Dean had wandered off partway through the 3rd time and Ashley never did find out where he'd gone. It wasn't like it mattered to Ashley. The important parts had been played by Glenna and Brad. She just wanted Brad to be with a woman he could be comfortable with. Ashley had known Glenna would be a great choice for Brad's first club experience. Actually, Ashley wasn't sure she liked how well those two had managed to connect. She let the unsettling thought fade. It wasn't important. The club wasn't very active tonight, but Brad knew it would start jumping later. He and Ashley had come early, chiefly because his parents had come early to pick up the girls for a weekend with them. They'd only held off a couple of weeks after their first trip to the Green Door. They'd come here twice in April and had great luck finding attractive couples. Brad still raved about one of the women. Ashley hadn't gotten along with the woman's husband quite as well, but she had no complaints. "Damn," Brad said explosively. He just caught sight of a woman coming in the front entrance. "What in the name of God does she think she's doing?" Brad asked incredulously. The woman was on the far side of 40 and round. "Brad," Ashley said reprovingly, "is she's just expressing her sexuality, you know? You shouldn't laugh at her. She's people too." Brad snorted. "Couldn't she express her sexuality in a gym or something?" he said derisively. "Good God, Ashley, how could a man get it up to do her? I don't see why she's even here." "Not everyone is a Barbie doll," Ashley told her husband. She was visibly annoyed. "And not every man is Ken, either," as she finished. Brad shrugged. He had never considered himself as handsome, and he didn't now. "Not everyone is a blimp, either," he said. "So, if I get fat someday, you're not going to love me," Ashley persisted. For the first time, Brad saw Ashley was taking this more seriously than he'd intended. So he did too. "I'll never have to wonder about that," he said sincerely. "You'll never let yourself go that bad and you know it." Ashley irritably shifted in her chair. Her husband was right, at least in that respect. "So you wouldn't love me if I was fat?" she demanded. Brad looked at her, wondering why this was such an issue. Ashley hadn't been a fat little girl and none of the pictures of her in her photo album showed the slightest problem with obesity in her family at all. Even so, he chose his words carefully. "If you someday in an unimaginable future if you lose enough respect for yourself that you get fat so bad you have to waddle from room to room, maybe then yes, I will probably lose respect for you too, and that might well be the beginning of losing my love for you," he said slowly. "If I'd married a woman with a genetic problem of some sort that made her more substantial than other women, that's a totally different matter," he added. "And no, I don't think I'm being shallow," Brad continued. "It's a matter of self-respect and staying healthy. You and I work out to keep from gaining too much unhealthy flab so we'll be there for the kids later on. I don't see the problem, Ash. If someone had told that woman 20 years ago she should get out and jog instead of stuffing her face, she'd be a lot better off and she'd live longer." Ashley couldn't find an argument to counter her husband's commentary. She filed the information away, though. Brad didn't like fat women and wouldn't make the effort to get it up for encounters with them. It was a thing she needed to know, no matter how resentful she felt about it. Her second husband hadn't been so picky. For the first time, Ashley began to wonder what she'd gotten herself into. "Now there's a woman and a half," Brad said enthusiastically, not noticing his wife's introspective moment. "Phew." The short Eurasian woman with a bold, impudent expression all across her features seemed too full of energy for her small body. Her husband, predictably, was at least 6 feet, 4 inches, tall. Brad was on his feet in a second and making his way past the couple to the bar for a refill on his Diet Coke. He grinned at the pair and said hello before passing them by. Brad's muscular upper body and slim waist attracted any number of women, and the Eurasian bombshell was no exception. Ashley watched as the small woman turned on her heel to watch Brad walk by. Without glancing at her man, she followed Brad up to the bar and stepped up behind him. Lifting his arm, she inserted herself practically under his elbow and threw an arm around his waist. She laughed up at him when Brad looked down to see what was happening. "Hi, honey," Brad said to Ashley when he came back to their table, arm in arm with the woman. "Look who followed me home," he added. Kitty, as she introduced herself, never left Brad and Ashley the rest of the evening. It was the first time Brad had chosen their partners instead of Ashley. There was a minor crisis that had to be ironed out first, though. Brad and Ashley adjourned for a quick 5-minute summit conference because Kitty's husband didn't want to participate in any himself. He got off just watching his wife having it with other men and women. Brad and Ashley decided the other couple was still a couple. Their rule wouldn't be violated if they had it with just Kitty, though she technically was a single woman in the club. Ashley remarked it might happen sometime with a single male in the same circumstances. Brad told her it was unlikely. He really had no intention of having it with her while another man was doing the same. He asked Ashley to make absolutely certain this was okay before she approved an encounter. He didn't want to take unfair advantage. Ashley understood. She didn't mind making it. She'd done it before, though she'd never told Brad. By the end of the night, the small-boned Eurasian woman was unable to walk without her husband's assistance. The female voyeurs watched speculatively as Brad walked casually to the shower room. Ashley watched them, knowing what they were thinking. They decided to check out house parties instead of going to a club this weekend. The last time they'd gone to the Green Door a couple of weeks ago, there hadn't been anyone there they really wanted to have it, and they hadn't been happy with the couple they finally went to a private room with. When they came out later with dissatisfied expressions, an attractive late-30s couple stopped them and invited them to a party at their house. They said Brad and Ashley fit the mold of the people they wanted to party with. Brad and Ashley looked the fit couple over and accepted on the spot. They changed their rules to accommodate new circumstances. That they would be partying in a more private atmosphere meant they no longer had to deal with a suspicion, admittedly mostly on Brad's part. One or the other might wander off. For the house party, they decided they only had to remain inside of one another while having it. It hadn't been difficult finding the Petersons' house. They were met at the door by Carrie Peterson wearing a nice, if unusually short, evening dress. None of the neighbors would suspect a thing. Brad noticed Carrie didn't wear the dress for more than a couple of seconds after the last invited guest arrived. Greta lived perpetually on the verge of plumpness and sometimes fell over the line. She worked hard to lose whatever she gained, though, and tonight was one of the good nights. She wasn't terribly pretty. About the best one could say was her features were pleasant. None of that mattered much to Brad. "You like it?" Greta asked Brad, looking up at him and grinning.